All right, good evening, everybody. It is 6 o'clock, so why don't we go ahead and get started with this evening's program. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the A&R Extension Educator for Clay and Owen counties. Tonight we're going to be giving our program Growing Great Tomatoes. This program was originally designed by Amy Thompson. She is a colleague of mine, and she's from Monroe County in Indiana. She worked very hard to put this together, and she has a lot of great information here. To give you a little background on myself, I have been an extension educator with Purdue for 4 years now, and I'm also an entomologist. So I can definitely answer a lot of your insect questions as well as some of your questions on pathogens and diseases. Tonight, we're going to go over a little bit of the growing practices of tomatoes and take a good look at some of the diseases and other issues you're going to face. Now, I'm going to ask everyone if you have questions, please put them in the chat box for me, and I will try to answer as many questions as I can when we get to the end of our program. If you have any trouble hearing me or if I fade in and out, just let me know and I'll make sure that I'm talking to my mic and not the ceiling. But let's go ahead and get dove in here. So one of the neat things that I discovered while researching a bit more on tomatoes for our program was just a little bit of the legends surrounding tomatoes and their history. It's not widely known that tomatoes originally came from the Andes in South America. And one of the neat legends you can find with a little bit of research is that when this plant was first introduced in what would become the United States, the first person who was going to eat one was warned that since this is a plant related to nightshade, it would turn his blood to acid and he would die. Needless to say, that did not happen, and since then, tomatoes have become widespread across the United States. I doubt that there is a county in Indiana where you can't find a healthy bumper crop of tomatoes produced just about every year. Now, like I mentioned before, tomatoes are a part of the nightshade family. This is not only going to include tomatoes, but also peppers, eggplants, potatoes, and a whole slew of other plants. Now, the good thing is there is nothing bad in any of these plants. They are not lethal to human beings at all, of course. Really, there are only a few plants that are part of the nightshade family that are actually dangerous to us. Most of the other plants we may plant as ornamentals or we may use in produce, like you could see in these pictures right here. Now, these plants can produce a lot of different varieties and a lot of different structures. Now, when it comes to tomatoes, though, we only think about the two primary structures that these plants are going to have, and we refer to those as determinate and indeterminate. Now, with determinate tomatoes, these are the big, bushy tomato plants that can produce lots of tomatoes all at one time. These are the ones that aren't going to be vining up a wall. Rather, they're going to just bush out, and you'll probably put a cage around them to protect them from other animals. Now, indeterminate tomatoes are the vining type. These are the ones that need to be staked. These plants can produce tomatoes throughout the entirety of the growing season. Now, I don't know about your experiences, but mine from when I was growing up, my mother almost always used vining types, the indeterminate plants that we'd stake out every growing season. And we'd have tomatoes for the whole year. There is no benefit or bad thing about having one or the other. Really, it's more of when do you want to have your tomatoes? Do you want to have them all season? And that's about it. The other thing that we consider when we're planting tomatoes is what types are we going to plant? Normally this comes down to, are you planting a hybrid or are you planting an heirloom? So let's go over just a little bit the differences between hybrids and heirloom tomatoes. Now, hybrids are a result of cross-pollination. This is where someone or like a group of scientists or a group of growers have gotten together and they are trying to take the best characteristics of two or more varieties. They're trying to weed out the bad parts, such as you have a really great tasting tomato, but it doesn't produce much. Well, let's combine it with a tomato that might not taste as great, but has great production, and they hybridize them together to try to produce a better plant. Hybrids typically are more uniform when they grow. They have typically higher yields, and they're able to have better resistance to disease and environmental factors. However, hybrids come with their own problem. When a plant is hybridized, sometimes their offspring aren't successful. It's a quirk of genetics, just like when you read stories about a liger, a offspring of a tiger and a lion. If you try to plant the seeds from a hybrid, you can't guarantee that what you're going to get is going to be the original hybrid variety that you wanted there. Typically, they're just a one and done. You buy the seeds or you get the transplant, you put it in the ground, you benefit from it, but you need to get new ones the following year. Now, when we talk about heirlooms, these are much different. These are openly pollinated plants that can be wind or insect pollinated. Sometimes they will be cross-pollinated from other tomatoes in the area. They can be done reliably in most areas where tomatoes are grown. I'm sure you've seen plenty of heirloom types grown all throughout our area. These varieties are ones that are normally adapted to a particular region. That means that if someone's growing a hybrid, if someone's growing an heirloom in Clay City, most likely that heirloom has been growing in Clay City for at least 50 years and it is adapted to that area. These things are valued because they have unique flavors, textures, colors. However, they aren't hybrids. They haven't been designed, which means that they don't have the disease resistance that you might be looking for. They may not store nearly as well. And when they become mature, may be different based on what they've just cross-pollinated with. Typically, when you try to buy an heirloom variety, you want to make sure that that's a variety that's actually going to work where you are, because if you buy an heirloom variety of it from Indiana and you decide to grow it in Illinois, it may be a much different story than the person who grows it in Indiana. So you're going to want to do a little bit of research to your heirlooms before you really make a choice there. That being said, just like with all things, this doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad. They're just different, and you're going to want to experiment with it before you make that kind of decision. Now, after you've actually gone through and chosen the varieties that you want to grow, you need to take into account the length of your season. So the map that I'm showing you right now is sort of a map of hardiness zones in Indiana, and this map's a little bbit dated. It's showing the dates of the last and first frosts within a year. Here you could see that we're looking at the last frost of spring took place in our area roughly April 26th, and the first frost took place at about October 6th through the 15th. This has remained fairly true for Indiana. I looked it up earlier today just to see what we were looking at in the Farmer's Almanac, and it looks like our first frost coming this fall is predicted to be October 9th, so it's not really varying very much at all right now. Now, when you want to put your tomatoes in the ground, you need to take that into careful account. One of the things that I will always tell someone when they're considering planting is, where are you going to put these, and have you tested the soil? Some of you may consider a soil test maybe the step too far, but this way you can tell yourself what is going on in that soil before you ever put a single seed or transplant in the ground. Is it got enough nitrogen? Does it have enough magnesium? Are there other issues happening that you just can't see? This is why you want to get soil tests done. They're cheap. Generally, labs that do nutrient soil testing will only charge you between $10 and $20, and it doesn't take much time at all. On top of that, when you get your soil test results back, if you don't understand what it's telling you, you can always bring it to your local extension educator and we can help you figure it out. All right, that's something we're trained to be able to help you with. Now, when you're considering, you know that you've got the right soil, you want to make sure that you are in full sun. Tomatoes are full sun plants. They will reach for the sun and get broad leaves as much as possible if they're healthy. You're also going to want well-drained soil. We're going to go over in a little bit why that is the case, but you want to make sure that that soil can have good flow of water through it so that way you can avoid pathogen issues. You want to make sure that you plant this away from trees and shrubs. There are a lot of properties in Indiana that have a lot of trees, especially black walnuts. Black walnut is one of the tree types that can toxify ground and prevent good plant growth. So you're going to want to have these in their own area where they're not going to be shaded by any other trees or shrubs, and that way no root systems are going to combine with them and no toxicity is going to occur. You want the land to be relatively level. You want to avoid lowlands. So keeping the land relatively level right there means that it's going to make it that much easier when you cage and stake these out. And you're not going to have to worry about the plants leaning over onto some high ground next to it. You will want to avoid the lowland because that way water isn't pooling right where you're growing your tomatoes. That's a great way to get disease issues. Avoiding contaminated soil kind of goes without saying. We've talked a little bit about that. Some plants can contaminate the soil through toxicity like black walnut, or if there was some kind of human activity on that soil you remember from a while ago, like there was a dump pile from when a house was being built or something, you want to avoid those areas because that can mean that the ground may be a little bit polluted and it might not be the best for growing plants until some time has gone by. And of course, one of the things that I consider common sense, and this will especially help out as you age, is plant close to water. Don't plant so far away that you need to be hauling buckets of water from wherever your outside spigot is to your plants. Make it easy on yourself. Keep it close to the water source, so that way you can run a hose line or an irrigation line or whatever, and you could spare yourself the backache. Now, when you live in the area that I do, you have a lot of opportunities to get different seeds or different transplants. And I imagine that's true for a lot of you as well. I live in Vigo County, Indiana, and every year there is an herb fair where my wife and I can go and choose different varieties of tomato transplants or seeds. And we have pretty much a great selection we can choose from. The trouble is understanding what's going to be best. Should I grow from a seed or should I grow from a transplant? There are ups and downs to both of these. Now, you want to be able to select good cultivars. Selecting a cultivar can be a little tricky. There are plenty of mail order catalogs and selection catalogs, or you can even look at garden centers and extension bulletins to choose what you're going to grow. Once you've made those choices, you want to choose whether you're doing seeds or whether you're doing those transplants. Seeds have the benefit, I'm sorry, I think I passed myself up here, I'm going to back up. So seeds have the benefit where you can grow lots of different hybrid seed, you have a lot of range of choice, and you can store them for an extended period of time. Transplants, however, don't have those options associated with them. Transplants, you will already be growing, you've already seen what they're going to do, and you're limited by the time of year you get them. You're not going to be storing a transplant in your house all year, like if you're trying to grow basil throughout the year. But this does mean, however, that whereas a seed needs to germinate and develop, a transplant is already starting to develop. It's already starting to show all the signs of being a healthy plant so long as you've made good choices. So that way you kind of saved yourself a little bit as you've gone. Now also, when you're choosing your varieties or cultivars, you absolutely must look for these letters. These letters define what kind of disease resistant your tomato plants have. And I know, like many of you who have grown tomatoes before, you have dealt with lots of different kinds of blights, fungal infections, and other problems that can occur with tomatoes. These resistance codes will tell you which cultivars have what resistances. And you can, just by going through a few of them, you can see here, the V stands for Verticillium Wilt, F stands for Fusarium Wilt. The number of F's in that code define which races of Fusarium it's resistance against. The N will stand for resistance to nematode, very small soil-borne worm species, or whether or not it'll be resistance to early blight or tomato spotted wilt virus. Look for these before you get any kind of seed. If you don't see this letter on a package of seed, don't buy that package. Here's a great example of what these are going to look like, and these packages really kind of tell you the whole story. You can see that every one of these is labeled with whether it's a hybrid or an heirloom. At least one of them is labeled with its growth type. Well, actually, all of them are labeled with their growth type, I'm sorry. You can see there's the Celebrity is determinate, the Big Beef is indeterminate, the Cherokee is an heirloom indeterminate, and you could tell which ones, like I said, are hybrid or heirloom. And perhaps the most important thing there is you can see those letter codes on the packages. You can see that 2 of these, the hybrids, all have clear letter codes on them that tell you which of these are actually going to be resistant to what diseases or what pathogens. Now, the heirloom, you can see here, doesn't have that letter code on them. Now, the reason for that is this has not been hybridized, so they don't know what traits have gone into this heirloom. And unfortunately, that's just something you'll have to deal with when you choose to grow an heirloom variety, because there isn't a good way to figure out what it's resistant to. That would be the exception to that case. If you ever see a hybrid that lacks a letter code, though, I would personally double check and potentially avoid that hybrid. Okay, so onto our transplant quality a little bit more in depth. You can see here that these transplants, they aren't very tall yet. They've got good leaf coverage developing, but they're not very tall at all. And this is a good sign of a good transplant. What this means is that these transplants have been allowed to develop to be bushy. They're ready for you to keep them inside at night, but you're going to move them outside during the day to let them harden, and they're going to keep growing. You want to make sure that you don't continue to grow these in your house, though, during the day. If you leave them indoors at all times, the plants will grow tall and spindly, and they're not going to develop very well at all. This is because, again, tomatoes are a full sun plant. You want to make sure you get them outside during that day so they can get used to that outdoor environment, get all that sunlight they need, because our windows are going to block a good portion of that sunlight. We just aren't able to tell very easily. Once you get them outside, they'll grow nice and bushy if they're determinate, or they'll start getting big broad leaves and growing up if they're indeterminate. And you can end up with lots of different looking plants, but this is a great example of how someone chose to move them. They've got them on these nice, neat trays where they can easily move them indoors and outdoors. Okay, a little bit on our soil preparation. This is also a critical part of growing tomatoes. Whether you're choosing to do a raised bed or whether you're doing it directly in the soil is up to you, but you're going to want to double check that soil each and every time you choose to plant. Again, I would reiterate, get a soil test. Get one every year, get one every 2 years. But make sure you know what is going on in your soil before you put a single seed in the ground. Now here, what they're doing is they have eliminated the grass and other species that have been growing in this area. You can use Roundup to do that. You can use organic methods or rip it out yourself to just clear that ground. You don't want any other plants growing in that particular piece of ground. Make sure you till up the ground nicely. It's going to take a few years to get it to the quality that you're wanting, but that tilling will help break up some of the previous plant material and hopefully get some of that more organic material in the soil. The goal is to get it nice and crumbly. Now you can see that they're adding organic material into their soil here. Once you till it, you're going to break up some of that organic material in the ground, so you're going to want to replace it. You're going to want to get good topsoil in there for these plants to develop in. If you're growing in like a community area, say you have a community garden, or you're growing in a plot of land that may be pretty compacted, this is going to be important. That compacted area really needs to be broken up so roots can reach through it, plants can get a good anchor. You're going to want to add that organic material to try to make sure that there are plenty of nutrients available for those plants. Now, one of the biggest problems that you will undoubtedly face as a gardener of any plant, let alone tomatoes, are controlling your weeds. This can be a really big challenge. Weeds are going to be growing up in between all of your plants at all times. Now, you have a few choices here. And unfortunately, not many of them are that feasible when it comes to tomatoes. If you try to use some kind of weed killer, they're most likely going to affect the very plants that you're trying to grow. 2,4-D is going to hit any plant that's considered a broadleaf, which includes tomatoes. Glyphosate is going to kill any plant that it comes near. And those are going to be pretty much the 2 most effective herbicides that you're going to be looking at. Neither of those can be applied in an area where you've got really big bushy tomatoes developing. So you're looking at potentially pulling weeds by hand or trying to use some other method to prevent the weeds from developing in the first place. Now, as much as I enjoyed pulling weeds for my mother, just like I'm sure all of you did too, I strongly recommend that you use other methods to prevent the weeds from coming up in the first place. So, that cute cartoon there. One of the things that we should consider when growing our tomatoes is some kind of soil covering, some kind of tarp or plant mesh that you can put over the ground and help encourage the soil to warm up. This will help the seeds to germinate faster, it'll help the plants to grow bigger faster, and since this black material is covering the soil, it prevents the weeds from getting any sunlight while still allowing the tomato plants to grow. You want to avoid using any kind of clear plastic. I know some people have recommended this before, but unfortunately this is just not a good idea. What'll happen is when you put clear plastic over the ground and poke holes to let your tomatoes grow through, you have now created a greenhouse, which has got moisture being added by you as you water your tomatoes and plenty of sunlight being reflected into the plants. So that means that the weeds are just going to grow out of control. While they may not get super big because they're trapped under this, they're just going to cover all the ground and they're going to eat up all the nutrients that you want to benefit your tomatoes. Consider mulching materials. Straw and old grass clippings are usually the most recommended thing that I have personally seen, and it seems to work fairly well. These won't harm the ground, they won't change the nutrient profile in the ground too much, and the tomatoes will just be able to grow through them without a whole lot of trouble so long as you make the space for them. There are also lots of different kinds of tarps that you can use. There's a wide selection out there. The big thing that I want you guys to take home from this, though, is when you choose your mulch, double check that whatever wood shavings or clippings you're using won't impact the soil that you're growing on. You don't accidentally want to toxify or ruin the nutrient profile of the soil as your tomatoes grow. Now, one of the big things that I always got taught growing up is how to stake your tomatoes. Just about every tomato plant you see in Indiana, whether it's determinate or indeterminate, is going to have some kind of stake or cage around it. You want your tomato plants to go up. You don't want them to come down. This means that the leaves will keep reaching for all that sunlight. It means the roots will like to grow downwards and create this great anchor for all of your tomato plants. I've seen many examples before of a downward growing system where someone has altered a 5-gallon bucket to hold water on top of soil and the tomato plant is basically upside down. I would say to you guys to avoid using this kind of system. What happens is you get water leakage that comes down through the plant and usually it results in blossom end rot. So keep your plants growing upwards, not downwards. Stick to how they do it traditionally here. Another issue that often comes up is the argument on whether or not to prune. This one has been argued back and forth in lots of circles. I'm not going to argue that one this evening because there are benefits and problems with pruning. If you prune a plant, that means that you are damaging that plant and you are potentially allowing disease to get in. However, sometimes pruning a plant can cause it to grow more. It can trigger its reactions to develop, and that can result in bigger plants. So I'm going to let you guys make that decision. If you are curious about it or have questions, I've left my contact information and Amy's contact information at the end of this slide set, so you guys just feel free to get a hold of us. You should already have my email from the links that I sent you, so feel free to make use of that. All right, so let's dive into the meat of tonight's program, the problems that we encounter with growing tomatoes. And there, unfortunately, are several, and I'm sure you've all encountered these before. So to start with, I've already mentioned this one, blossom end rot. This can result if you choose to grow plants in the upside down system that I described before. This can be the result of water leakage. It could be the result of a few different fungal diseases that happen within tomato. It can also be the result of deficiencies in nutrients. There are a few different causes there. What I would say is keep an eye on all of your fruit, remove anything that is damaged there, and monitor how well you're watering the plant. If you aren't watering it enough, you may want to consider increasing, but you don't want to water so much that you're drowning out the plants. In this case, what I'm seeing here is most likely someone may have overwatered, and this is causing the blossom end rot. All right, so Amy added on this a little bit here, and I'll just go through it point by point. In this case, for tomatoes, it's caused by deficiency of calcium in the fruit for what we're seeing right here. However, there could be enough calcium in the soil and the fruit's not getting it. The reason for this is that it did not get enough consistent sources of water. So when I talk about that vertical growing system, or the upside down growing system, I should say, what happened there was people would put water in, but it wasn't very consistent, or it would just stay on top and it didn't get through the plant. You want to make sure that your plants are watered regularly, very consistently with the same amounts. Don't drown out your plants, because then you could cause another whole other problem or get blossom end rot again. Mulching will help keep that soil moist, which is why it's a good idea. Just make sure you don't use clear plastic to do it. And keep in mind that oftentimes that first fruit set is more likely to have blossom end rot. So monitor it as it begins to grow. All right, our next disease. This one is one that we see quite a bit, called Verticillium Wilt. Typically, tomato plants don't wilt very easily. So wilting is just a nice name for what happens to these leaves as they dry up and die. You will see the yellowing of the lower leaves in the plant. And this is because there is a fungal illness going through the plant that's blocking up its vascular system. In the case of Verticillium wilt, if you cut into the plant stem, you'll see that the pith has turned brown as the fungus has begun to spread through it. So monitor that, and if you suspect and you have plants that are dying, take one of the dying plants, cut into the stem, and see what's going on inside there, and that can help you get some more information. Fusarium wilt is different from Verticillium wilt. You'll often see it wilting on one side only, and sometimes this can be confused with a pesticide drift incident. So I wouldn't worry too much about that immediately with tomatoes. I'll give you guys some examples of what to look for in a little bit if there is a pesticide drift incident. In the case of this, though, usually you'll see one side of the plant just suddenly starts turning bright yellow, the leaves will curl. But if you look into the pith, if you cut into that stem and take a look inside, you're going to see that the pith is still healthy. That's because in this case, that pathogen is going through the vascular system, but it's not intruding into the actual pith of the plant. Okay, this is a famous one, early blight. This is caused by an agent known as Alternaria solani. This one has a really telltale sign of when it gets there. If you look at the images of the leaves in this picture, you could see this kind of concentric ring shape on the leaves. That is very, very telltale of Alternaria being present. You can see in the other image that there's a lot of die-off in the lower leaves, and you can see that this is hitting at just the right time because a lot of these fruits have not yet finished. You can see a lot of green tomatoes on the plant still. Septoria Bilght. This one is probably by far the most common one that I get calls on. Now, let's compare some of these leaf images for a moment here. If we go back to Alternaria or early blight, you can see that there are a lot of concentric rings formed in that spot on the leaf tissue, and there's kind of a ring of yellow around the outside. If we move to Septoria, however, you can see there's kind of a bullseye shape there. The spot on the leaf has a very pale center, and then it darkens around it, and then there's yellowing or light green around the edges of that. And that is a very, very clear sign of Septoria Bilght. You can also see in the other image that the lower leaves are also dying off in this case. So to be able to tell the difference between the two, both of them are going to have lower leaves dying off, so you're going to have to use what the spots on the plants look like to be able to know what you're dealing with. Now, bacterial spot is a whole other beast. The ones that we've talked to up till now have been fungal diseases, diseases spread by spores, and all those spots you've seen are fruiting bodies that are spreading those spores. In this case, bacterial spot is of course caused by a bacteria. You can usually tell when it's present by taking a careful look at the leaf surfaces in the plant. Sometimes the leaf surfaces will be moist, they'll be gummy. A lot of them, you'll begin to see the rot form around them. Sometimes the leaves will have hypernecrotic reactions where the plants will kill some of the cells that have been infected to try to maintain a wall around the bacteria so it doesn't move around. You can also take a look at some of the plant parts that may be about ready to break off if they're dying off, or you can look at some of the healthier stems. If you cut through them and then touch the two cut ends together, you may see that there's ooze sticking between each cut part. That is sometimes known as bacterial streamers, and it's a good sign that there's actually bacteria going through that plant's vascular system, which is causing the infection. Bacterial spot will ultimately end up in fruit getting lesions on their surface, and you can see these very, very clearly in this image. And unfortunately, these fruits, they're just going to go bad because there's now a bacteria spreading through them, and that bacteria is just going to eat up these fruits just like you or I would. Now, there are a few leaf spot diseases that also occur in tomatoes. Often, the most famous of the leaf diseases is usually leaf curling, but in some cases, leaf spots will also occur, and the instances of those diseases are normally told apart by what they do to the leaves. For example, you can see in the image on the left, you see that a portion of that leaf has gone necrotic and is dying off all the way down to the petiole on the leaf. Whereas in the other two images, the lower one you see widespread spotting, and then in the upper one you could see wide, almost frog eye-like spots developing on its surface. So I'm not going to go over any particular one in depth here. I'm just going to make sure that you guys know that you could tell them apart by the way they look. What I would do is bring these into your extension educator. Use us to help you identify these diseases. Because the minute we can identify it, then we're going to know what to be able to do with this. So what you're seeing here is referred to as zipper scars. Zipper scars are unique. It's mainly due to plant genetics. This is where the blossom doesn't properly detach from the fruit, and it causes scarring on the surface of the fruit as it grows. This one I would expect to find pretty commonly in some heirlooms because the genetics may not be very clear in those heirlooms. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the tomato is going to be ruined. It means that there may be damage there that'll have to be removed. And if it's bad enough, you could see it actually break past the surface skin of the actual fruit. And it almost looks as though an insect damaged it, where there are these holes bored right into the fruit. Unfortunately, there's nothing you can do about zipper scars. You may want to consider switching up varieties, taking a look at different things if this is a consistent problem. Other than that, you may just, if you're really in love with this particular variety, you may have to deal with it. Fruit cracking is also another issue that you may commonly see. This is where the fruit is actually developing faster than the skin of the tomato. This could be due to a few different causes, genetics, nutrients, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, the tomato is probably not going to remain in a very good state after a fruit cracking incident has happened. You might be able to salvage some of it, but if the fruit keeps growing through this, ultimately it's going to kind of rip the fruit apart a little bit, and I'm sure you've seen instances where this has occurred. And of course, Sunscald. This one you can usually find when they've been exposed to far too much sun for too long during especially hot summers. Basically, the tomato is pre-cooked for you. And it'll cause this yellowing on the surface, and you'll see that surface begin to collapse there. If you see sun scalding beginning to occur, you might want to consider providing a little bit of shade for the fruit developing, or it could be linked to the fruit's genetics. Cat facing is another issue we often find in tomatoes where you'll begin to see edges break apart, kind of like what you see in one of the earlier slides I showed you. This will happen as the fruit develops and grows. Ultimately, you'll see the fruit become warped around where those cat-facing moments occurred. These are still good to eat. You'll have to take out the bad parts, but they are still viable as edible food. The biggest problem that probably a lot of growers run into is that it just looks unappetizing, so they'll usually throw these away. But that doesn't necessarily need to be the case when there's cat-facing happening. Now, I mentioned earlier that I was going to talk to you a little bit about what is happening with a pesticide drift incident. So usually we could tell pesticide drift incidents apart from moments where there may be a virus at work fairly easily. If your plant has deformed leaves on it, this is usually caused by either pesticide or by a virus. Now, if it's a pesticide, you're going to see it affect one area of the plants. For example, if your neighbor may have accidentally sprayed something in his yard, only the side of the plants facing their yard are going to be affected by pesticides. However, if you see this occurring on the entirety of the plant, that's probably not pesticide exposure. Pesticide exposure doesn't really work in that way. Most likely you're looking at an instance where there could be a virus at work, damaging the plant. Now, wilting I mentioned earlier, and I said it was fairly rare. This is generally caused by either a lack of nutrients being given to the plants or a lack of water. I would be very surprised if you have just an instance of wilting that's due to environmental factors, unless there's one major issue that's occurring. Typically, what I would expect to see is for you to have problems with disease long before you would have an actual wilt occur. Now, I did mention before that oftentimes leaf deformation can be caused by viruses. In this case, you were looking at one of the more common ones. This is leaf roll virus. What this is doing is it's literally just like it sounds. It caused the leaves to roll up as though they were tobacco. Now, this won't impact your fruit unless the leaves lose their ability to get sunlight very well. A lot of tomato plants can get a pretty heavy infection of leaf rolling and still be able to produce pretty good fruit. There's no way to cure this with any reasonable materials right now. So if you get this, you may just have to deal with it. But I wouldn't panic too much. If leaves start browning and dying, you might consider removing them from the plants. But otherwise, you may just have to learn to live with it if you get a leaf rolling virus. Okay, so before we dive into insects, I wanted to cover one thing, and I want to go back a little ways and talk about some of our fungal infections. So let's go back to talking about some of our blights here. Now, we went over several of these. They all have different disease characteristics to help you identify them. But the good thing is that a lot of the ways that you avoid getting them and you help yourself out is simply by planning ahead of time. Fungal diseases rely on us not managing our soil and not managing our sanitation. So anytime you decide that you want to plant tomatoes, you need to make sure that you're doing it in a sanitary way. That means that your tools have been sanitized. That means that you've double-checked your soil and aren't planting again after a year of having tomatoes that were infected with something. If your tomatoes last year got some kind of leaf blight on them and you decide to plant in that same ground again the following year, you're going to get what you had the year before. You're going to get an infection. Space your plants apart as well. If you have plants that are only 6 inches apart from each other, that means any water splashing, any wind that blows, anything that brushes against them could spread a pathogen from one plant to the other. Spread your plants at least 2 feet apart. Preferably more, but I know that may not work in some growing situations. Remember, all of these diseases, from Verticillium to Fusarium to early blight, all of them rely on their spores being spread. Keep these things spread, Don't use the same soil the next year. Let those spores die in the soil after a few years. Make sure you rotate your crops through, just like this slide says, and you will help yourself minimize the instances of these pathogens occurring. And unfortunately, these are the most common pathogens in tomatoes. Now, you can also get some fungicides that are going to help you fight off these things. Usually there's some kind of copper hydroxide product that you can get. We do have some resources. I think I have a few at the end of this slide set I can show you. You need to check the labeling on any products you choose to spray on these plants. Make sure that they are labeled for tomatoes and the different diseases that are affecting them. And this is why I also said earlier, bring these in to your extension educator. We can identify what is going on here and help you make the choices to get the right products to protect your tomatoes. Now, when it comes to bacteria, these are also very similar to what you would do for a fungal disease. When you have a bacterial disease, you want to make sure that water cannot splash between plants. That is how bacteria is going to spread. If you put these too close together, you're going to have the same problem you would with a fungal disease. Make sure there's no splashing water. Make sure there are no dead leaves from the tomatoes on the ground or any dead limbs. And if there are any infected plants that are doing really poorly, for example, something like this, you may want to destroy those plants to protect all the other ones. These will spread very easily. All right, so when we're talking about insects now, that spreading of the plants counts just as much. Now, there aren't too many insects we're going to discuss over the course of this. The prime one is the one that you all probably think about every year, tomato hornworm. When I was growing up, my mom paid me a nickel for every one of these that I removed from her tomato plants, and I bet a lot of you had the same experiences that I do. Now, tomato hornworms aren't going to move very easily from plant to plant. If you're an insect and your world is a leaf, trying to get over to a plant that's 2 feet away is the equivalent of walking 800 miles. They don't want to move that far because they want to grow. They want to develop into their adult form. So they're just going to keep hunting leaves. Now, the good thing about tomato hornworms is that these insects will generally only focus on leaves. And when they're at their most damaging stages, they are generally really far into their developing. So this big fat hornworm, the pair of them that you see here, they're actually fairly close to becoming adults. So their damage, while it's at its highest point, isn't going to go much further. They're going to start turning into cocoons to begin their adult life. You can also see in the lower right picture there that there are insects that will parasitize these worms. There's a braconid wasp that likes to use these as a food source. So what it'll do is it'll lay its eggs on this insect. The eggs will hatch, and then the wasp larva will eat the caterpillar from the inside out. So you have some help from nature in getting rid of these. As for a recommendation on what to do when you have tomato hornworm, unfortunately, what's worked in the past is going to work for the future. Pull them off by hand. Put them in a bucket of soapy water. And then dispose of them however you want. I don't generally recommend any kind of pesticide to get rid of these because I feel like that really isn't necessary for this kind of problem. Unless you have an exceptionally bad infestation, you're probably not going to have that many worms on a given tomato plant. And also, these worms don't generally go after the fruit. There are a few instances where you may see that, but for the most part, they're going to stick to the leaves, and it's going to be so far into the season that they really won't be causing that much damage to what you're ultimately going to get as a crop. Now, stink bugs represent a really nasty problem for a lot of our plants. Now, stink bugs are a little bit different from our caterpillars. Plant spacing won't help against stink bugs. They are very capable flyers, and as I'm sure a lot of you have seen, they're more than willing to fly into our homes and onto virtually every other surface you can find. Stink bugs feed in a unique way. Instead of having some kind of mouth to chew food with, they instead have a syringe that they will poke directly into a fruit or a leaf of a plant. And they'll drain out the inside of that plant and leave these pale, dry spots within the fruit, as you can see in the picture on the top right. Now, they don't damage the fruit to the point that it's inedible. You can just cut out the bad parts and the fruit is still perfectly good, so long as it's not been drained too badly. However, they can pretty easily transfer diseases between plants, so that could result in some problems on leaf tissue and actual growing surfaces of the plants. They'll just tend to kind of ruin the fruit if they overfeed on it, like that bottom center picture you see there. The easiest thing to do with stink bugs is monitor for their eggs. If you look at the image in the lower left, you can see that there's a picture of the eggs right there, these tiny little balls that are all stuck together, and generally they're on the underside of a leaf. Scrape those off of every leaf you can find, put them in a bucket of soapy water, and get rid of them. Those are going to be where your new stink bugs come from. Again, I generally wouldn't recommend using pesticides on them because I think it just would be better to brush these off and take them off by hand. They will continue throughout the summer. They will keep getting on your plants even after the pesticide effectiveness is worn off. And if you use a pesticide on developing tomato plants, you may accidentally hit an insect or another animal who's helping to protect your plants. So again, manual labor is probably going to get you home on this one. Now the last big problem with tomatoes, and this is especially true for me, are our local critters, squirrels, chipmunks, and everything else like that. If you live a place like where I do, the squirrels around me are gigantic, and they have made off with tomatoes in my wife's garden. These can be a big problem. I would recommend to try to solve your problems with larger mammals or organisms is to cage your tomatoes effectively. Make sure that animals can't get into them. If you need 2x4s and chicken wire on all sides of a plant, then do that. These guys are very good at getting into things. They can chew through a lot of different materials, and they are very tenacious. If they want a fruit, they're going to do their best to get it. We do have some publications out on our Purdue Ed store that you can look at to learn a little bit more about the different animals that may attack different plants and how you can handle them. But honestly, the best way to handle them is just to put a barrier between your plants and them. All right, I've mentioned a few different resources as I've talked throughout this evening. So one of those resources is the Purdue Tomato Doctor. This is an app you can find on the Play Store or the Apple Store. It costs about 99 cents, and it helps you identify disease and manage insects. It'll help give you some information on what to do with those diseases and some of the products that you can use to fight them. I actually looked this up earlier today to make sure that we still had it going, and it is still on there. And like I said, it's only 99 cents, so it's a worthwhile investment. We also have several publications available to you. This is one of my favorite ones by Daniel Eggle. And you can find this on our Purdue Ed store, and a lot of our extension offices around the state will have these available for you. This one's a really nice one because it gives really good imagery and gives really good explanations as to what the different diseases will do, more than I could fit into an hour-long program. And you can see some of the images in this are actually ones that were used in this presentation even. This is another great one from Iowa State University. It goes over the different diseases and disorders that tomatoes can have and gives you, again, another set of pictures to go off of. Part of the reason that I want you guys to take a look at these is because you can't get enough pictures of these diseases. They can present themselves in lots of different ways. So I'd highly recommend taking a look at a bunch of these so you can get great ideas on what to look for as the season begins to go on. And of course, if you really truly can't figure something out, and if there's a problem that one of the extension educators can't help you with, we can always send something to our Plant and Pest Diagnostic Laboratory up on Purdue's campus. Now, the scheduling with it right now is a little funny because of the current pandemic, but they are still at work helping people identify things. And you can always go to their website. You just type in Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Laboratory into a Google search bar or any search bar, and it'll take you straight to it. They will have instructions on how to submit a sample, and in maybe a couple weeks, they'll get you back some information that you can take advantage of. And if you're not sure what it says, you can always bring it to one of the extension educators, and we will help you with it. All right, so that is the end of my presentation. and I've left my